So I thought this week, before we officially kicked off with the things that we want to talk about, including DeepSeek, NATO, and we're very UK centric this week, which I think is not a bad place to be because normally we're fairly American centric. But there were some other news headlines that caught my eyes. I wanted to just quickly touch on these and then see if it sparked anything with you fine people.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
So the Czech central bank he wants to buy millions of euros in Bitcoin, about 5% of their reserve at 7 billion euros, which seems like an interesting call to action. I guess while Trump is in power, no bad thing. Andreessen has left the UK this week, so their crypto fund, or primarily crypto fund, has gone back to the US, which kind of makes sense because they're very crypto friendly, and obviously Trump and deregulation. The French startup Swan has raised a Series B extension, which I've never seen before. I don't know if you guys have seen this before. So Swan have raised another 42 million euros on top of their 37 million euros raised Q3 23. We've got the Oxford-Cambridge ARC now back on track, so UK Silicon Valley. So I know we're going to talk a bit about that later. I saw a report today about US investors pulling back from anything sustainable ESG, and this is a continued mirror in Europe. But there's been outflows around £30 billion from ESG funds over the pond. So I think that's gonna come over here. And 18 ARM employees. Now, there was a report this week about 18 of the ARM employees, like an ARM mafia, the Cambridge chip people. 18 employees are now setting out on their own, building their own startups, which, Mads, you were talking about the original. Tell us the story of the original instigator of Silicon Valley, because I think that's just a really interesting place to start.
I mean, no, it sort of harked back to William Shockley and Shockley Semiconductor and the traitorous eight that set out to build Fairchild. And I mean, there was noise and more, and some of the folks that ended up founding Intel and became really the kind of founders of Silicon Valley. So when I saw this, I sort of immediately thought, oh, have all these 18 gone to create something new and exciting in one place? Is it our Fairchild? But it sounds like it's a lots of different exciting projects they're on too, so maybe not quite a parallel.
No, but I loved it because it reminded me of the PayPal mafia and those guys and girls going off and doing their own things, and the Skype mafia and those guys and girls doing their own things.
We need more mafias in Europe, yeah, for sure.
We do. We need more recycling. I just thought it was just a lovely story. But first up, we're going to kick off with this NATO defense spending push. So the backstory is that Lithuania and Estonia have now pledged to meet Donald Trump's 5% target on defense spending. For context, the UK is currently spending about 2.25% of GDP on defense. Spain is the bottom of the list at 1.25%. So I guess the question for the room is this an opportunity for startups? How is this going to affect our investment strategies? Are you looking at defense? What's happening with you in defense? And Andrew, do you want to kick off?
Sure. I mean, I think, a lot of Europe's underpaid its way for quite a while. And so this is all good news. I remember in the last Trump administration, one of the few things I agreed with him about was that European member states need to pay their way and the NATO members need to pay their way. But there's a huge gulf in capability, and I think that's what really matters. It's not, for me, so much about the exact percentage being spent. It's about the capability of the countries in Europe as a whole. And there are some big holes in our capability. We rely on the US for strategic airlift and mobility, which means we don't have enough transport aircraft like the C-17 or the Airbus A400s. US dominates in space-based intelligence. Satellites, I think it's got over 250 military satellites. They're probably just the ones we know about. Europe has literally a handful. UK's got some impressive capabilities, the cyber, but just overall, Europe as a whole does not have reach for things like SIG intelligence or even battlefield intelligence. I mean, the UK has a joint rivet aircraft, and belatedly, Germany and Italy and France are sort of deploying their own SIG solutions. I think the Swedes have a Gulfstream aircraft which is fitted with electronic warfare and signals intelligence equipment. But there's just this big list of stuff which for many, many years you've just assumed the Americans will fill in the holes. So if Europe or a bunch of European countries want to deploy troops even within the European theatre at any speed, let alone outside the European theatre, there are major problems in doing that. And that's before you get onto sort of munition stockpiles and this sort of stuff, and long range precision weaponry. I just think Europe's got a long, long way to go. So yeah, we need to spend a lot more money and make the decision that spending that money is the best way to keep the peace, which if we don't, will cost a lot more money.
So strength through, what was Trump's
Strength through deterrence.
moniker? Strength through power or something. I've got what it is. He's got this kind of like cheesy pocket phrase. Mads, you've got some of the numbers behind the scenes as well, haven't you?
Yeah, while we talk about quotes, I think it was Roosevelt who said that the kind of the art is to talk softly and walk with a big stick, which I thought there was some poetry to.
Was he the president with polio? Is that what the stick was for?
Possibly. Walking stick, walking cane. Yeah, so if we think about the world, so, about $100 trillion of GDP, of which NATO is roughly half, so 51 trillion all told. So about half of the globe's production comes out of the NATO countries. And I think, as Andrew said, 2.7% currently spent on defense. So that's $1.3, $1.4 trillion. So increasing that to 5% would mean another 1.2 trillion, which is, when you think about it, it's quite a lot of money. So there's a lot of guns. And I know we've been throwing around big numbers here. Kind of Nvidia's market cap seems to swing by half a trillion every day. So yeah, maybe everything is relative.
Well, DeepSeek knocked out 1.2 trillion off the markets, didn't it? So
there you go. So it's just basically a DeepSeek sized influence. A question in my mind with this stuff is always, are there better ways we can invest to make our society safer other than just buying guns? It seems traditional defense procurement maybe isn't that nimble, maybe isn't that creative. Are there things we can do in education or health? Are there things we can do in cyber? I should be doing in cyber. I think we probably need to spend more, whether it's another trillion on tanks, I don't know. But it seems that however you think about whether it's a good idea or not, more will be spent. And so if you're looking for opportunity, this seems like an obvious place because there's just going to be so much more money coming into this sector over the coming years.
Yeah, Lomax, you've done a little bit of digging here. You're also looking at China, weren't you?
Well, I was trying to step back and look at absolute numbers spent on defense, right? So China, I think at the last count, it's obviously very hard to work out exactly, but is spending 500 to 600 billion a year on defense. So the US still is way and above the biggest spender on defense, I think at about 850 billion, right? So it's still the NATO countries and the US, these are vast, vast numbers. And we're looking, as Mads said, at increasing them. I think in the increasingly unstable world that we live in, this is the right thing to be doing. I think, as Andrew alluded to, Europe has ceded a lot of its defense and defense tech sovereignty to the US and over-relied on US support in defense over the last, since the Second World War, quite frankly. And one thing I was very interested listening to a politician speaking the other day is that, the European defense infrastructure has become so reliant on the US, software, as Andrew said, some of their aviation capability, that actually the ability of European member states or European countries within NATO to defend themselves without even the US has been eroded away. And I think that kind of sovereignty needs to be built back in, because what we've learned from Trump is that he doesn't really care about anyone else. And actually, when you have an unreliable counterpart in the White House, you don't really want to be relying 100% on that person. I mean, Mads, you're from Denmark. Clearly your prime minister's been having some interesting conversations with him, but the way he treats his allies, I think, means that the US, God bless them, is an unreliable bedfellow. So I think the more that, of course, NATO will continue, and I think we'll work together in harmony. But I think the actual, sovereignty within European defense needs bolstering. And look, Airbus is an amazing success story, right? On the kind of civilian aviation side, like we can do it in Europe. We have the capability. We actually have the budget. I don't disagree with you, Mads, but I do think that we should be, the money is well spent here. And it's not just on guns and tanks. It's obviously on, I would say, includes like software, cyber capabilities as well. What does that mean, for startups and investors like us? I think we talked about this on this pod before, but dual use, great place to be investing. Pure play defense startups, if you've got the stomach for it, great place to be investing. And these budgets are going to be set now for the next 5, 10, 15 years, regardless of who's in the White House, regardless of who's, in the European seat of power. So from a kind of next almost quarter century perspective in a venture landscape, it's not a bad place to be investing.
I was just going to say a comment, Lomax, on the reliability of America as an ally is a really poignant one. And certainly, I'm sure this is true for other European states as well, but certainly with the UK, there's very much been an attitude, I think, in the US over the years of, we want you to be good and we want you to support yourselves, but don't be too good, because we don't want you with capabilities that are too good, because we don't want our market, the rug pulled from under us. And we've seen that with political pressure over the years with projects going way back to the 1960s, like TSR-2, which is a highly advanced aircraft, and pressure was put on the government to buy the F-111, which turned out to be a crap aircraft, and eventually we didn't buy it. And you've seen this pattern, and I think we need to be realistic about the alleged special relationship. And behind the scenes, there certainly is a special relationship between the UK and the US, particularly in actually cyber warfare and intelligence sharing. But America's very good at looking after itself, and we have to remember that. And I think strength is important in any negotiations, including with your friends. So I think it's a really
completely agree. Now, a question in my mind, and Andrew, maybe you can help shed some light on it, because my concern with it. So let's say investing more in defense is a good thing. We should do it. It seems to me that there's sort of two approaches we've seen historically, which is the European approach, which is we try and stretch ourselves and then we get it wrong, right? We end up building aircraft carriers, but then we can't quite afford the aircraft to put on the carriers. And it's just sort of thing after thing that doesn't quite seem to work. And then there's the U.S. approach, which is if the appropriation is for defense, we will sign the check no matter how silly the program is. To the point where the DOD has failed, 5 audits now in a row. They can't even figure out where the money goes. It seems like a total money pit. Neither of those two approaches seem to serve the taxpayers or serve anybody very well. What is an approach we could take here if we said, look, let's actually go out and increase annual defense spending by 50, 60, 70% to ensure that we get some, frankly, value for money?
Well, there's a difference between choosing to spend the money and how you spend the money. I think Elon and his Department of Doge one of his big gripes has been that departments in the US government can't say how they spend the money. And that's a ubiquitous problem across Western governments, right? And so I think that does need solving. And I'm not suggesting that we don't work hard to change procurement and we don't work hard to engage startups and do things more sensibly than they've been done before, not write big blank checks. But the big question is an existential one of, do you believe a future mass conflicts is possible? And what are you willing to spend now to prevent that, rather than spending 10x that in gold and blood or more much later on? And so for me, it's a secondary question of then how do you spend the money better? But one that I agree with you definitely needs solving. The main problem is that there are people who are far greater experts on this topic than me, but from what I've seen over the years in Europe and certainly in the UK, the main problem is inconsistent strategy, changing governments with changing political views, keep changing the goalposts on specifications of large projects, which opens the door to the BAEs and other big defense contractors having an excuse to charge even more, and the budgets continue to go up and up and up. And so, how we think about those contracts and how those contracts are written. And you saw this with SpaceX, right? First company offering NASA a contract for a service. You give us this money, we'll agree to deliver X. That was actually never done before. It was always time plus whatever. Well, you'll have to keep paying us until we manage to build this thing for you. And so that's madness.
And actually, so I think that's a great point, Andrew. And I think back to Dan's question, what is the role of the venture capital community, what's the role of startups here? I think Helsing, have said it well, because I think what they're saying is, look, instead of doing this whole cost plus, where you come with a set of specifications and then you basically buy something off a PowerPoint and it takes 10 years to develop, you need to have capital that goes in and underwrites specific programs, specific technologies, develops them, and then sells them. And do you know what? That's what we do every day in the companies we back and invest in. So I like the direction. I think there can be a lot more coming out of it, but it requires a mindset shift where there is courage to do business with new companies, frankly, and not just put orders through to the same old primes again and again.
Absolutely. And that you've nailed it with that word, courage, and an acceptance of risk, which is not culturally acceptable within the civil service or with many governments today. And I think that change has happened in the US. We backed a company called Castilian, US hypersonics company. They've just raised $100 million the last couple of weeks from A16 and a couple of others. And they're only 2 years old. They've already got a flying hypersonic weapon prototype. I mean, these companies can move so much faster, but you've got to have the political will and the leadership to convince the institutionalized civil service bureaucrats that it's okay to fail. And that's the big shift.
Maybe those licenses have been offered. Maybe Trump being in power and this kind of push for defense spending and this renewed, maybe America World Police isn't going to be around to protect us. This whole notion is going to accelerate these very conversations. I read an article this week effectively suggesting that World War III may have already begun. And it was just a hypothesis. It was just a really interesting historical kind of viewpoint that a lot of what we look back on, the timings around World War II were years apart. And what if in 30, 50, 100 years' time, we look back at now, this period of time, and actually bundle in the conflicts and the challenges that we're seeing now as the beginnings of World War III.
Yeah.
So I'll share.
The start of World War II is still heavily debated, of course, what year that happens. World War III could have started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, for all we know.
Yeah.
Just one thing to finish on that, and listening to Ben, a very good interview with Ben Wallace the other day, the former Defence Secretary of the UK. We said historically in the 90s, 2000s, the teens, the first budget that anyone raided, any Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, was the defence budget. They got whittled away over decades and decades and decades. And with we've had the wave of the centre-left governments in Europe in the last 20, 30 years, these big projects from, Merkel, originally, New Labour in the UK. Defence was unsexy, not a place we should be investing in. And as I said, the budgets were whittled away. Now we're kind of entering, as we just talked about, a long period where I think people recognize that there needs to be long-term investment here. So we will see a change. But I think as Andrew and Mads have pointed out, the way that that's executed by the civil service in the UK and, their counterparts in Europe needs to be changed to give certainty to private contractors such that, it's actually a good place to do business and, make return value for shareholders and other stakeholders.
It feels like it's possibly not a bad sector to lean into if you're in startup investing land. Now, I want to get really UK-centric. We've got 4 or 5 topic threads that are all around the same theme. Reeves on Wednesday talked about turbocharging UK growth. So we've got the National Wealth Fund, the Office for Investment. Reeves has tasked them both to work together with local leaders across the UK to build pipelines of incoming investment and projects linked to regional growth priorities. Now, I couldn't, digging into this, I couldn't quite work out who was, obviously, National Wealth Fund is the big infrastructure projects. Office for Investment, fairly unsure. You've got the British Business Bank doing the smaller side and some of that money obviously coming through people like us and into the venture capital scene, into startups. But Mads, where did you want to start? Because you've got the UK Silicon Valley, we've got Reeves's discussion on Wednesday, we've got airports expansions, we've got a number of spaces that we can start with. We've even got the UK pensions unlock. So Mads, where would you like to start with this?
No, I'll start somewhere completely else just to be controversial and just
Do it.
Going back to the chat we had. earlier, I think, Lomax, you were saying, looks like Reeves has come out sort of being sniped in the back from her own team. Immediately you had both ministers in government and also kind of local city leaders like Sadiq Khan sniping and saying, look, we don't support the third runway at Heathrow. We don't think some of these things are very good ideas. This is not what we should be doing. And I think you said, look, they should have taken longer to get their ducks in a row so they don't have this infighting. It doesn't look good. And I thought, yes, of course, that would make sense. But to some extent, is that also a symptom of sort of this very British way we have of behaving, of we should consult everybody and we should all hold hands and we should all talk about it until we all agree. And you compare and contrast that with the approach from the US. Now, Trump, like him or loathe him, within 24 hours of assuming the White House, kind of the presidency, he had announced a $500 billion Starship project to get AI turbocharged in the US. There's nothing Reeves has said or done this week she couldn't have said 6 months ago. And I think to some extent, no matter how you approach this, you're going to offend people. So I think it's the job of leaders to lead. And this is not new stuff. We've been talking about an airport expansion at Heathrow for decades. If this is the government's priority, which I think it should be, by the way, why didn't they come out and say this 6 months ago? Why are they not far more forceful in driving through this change? Now, I think overall, it's government's job to figure out how to get stuff done. And we have huge problems in the country because of Brexit, because of skill shortages. But that shouldn't hold us back. We need to focus on the stuff we then can get done. And there are lots of examples of things that got done and got done very quickly when we wanted to. I think we should come back to some of those in a minute, but let's go around the room and hear some other thoughts. I mean, guys, do you agree or do you have a fundamentally different take?
No, I mean, I don't. I agree in the sense that I don't think we need to wait for like general consensus across like the Labour Party, the government in charge, to make these big decisions. But I actually feel, because we were talking predominantly about the fact that there are members of the cabinet who I think are pretty against this, and also more importantly, the Mayor of London, who's going to need to potentially approve this, is very against this, right? So I was just saying, at least get the. We have this concept in the UK of collective cabinet responsibility, like the cabinet, at least the cabinet, the 14, 15, 16 members of cabinet are supposed to be aligned. And you talk about showing leadership. Well, that's where Keir Starmer leans in as prime minister and gets his ministers in a room and says, we are behind this. It's funny, actually, this is coming from Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and not coming from Keir Starmer, because, he's voted against this in the past, right? Heathrow, the specific issue, I think everyone's agreed on growth, right? And I think that's become the new government in the UK from the middle of last year have had growth as a big part. It was a reasonably big part of their manifesto. It's become an even bigger part of their story now, given the continued anemic growth that we have in the UK. And by the way, the context here is that the UK GDP is growing. It's basically flat. It's 0.3 to 0.5%, whereas in the US, it's, 2.5 with the last check. So even the Eurozone growth is actually higher than the UK, which is actually shocking.
I mean, you saw the French and the German figures, right? They were pretty much flatlined.
But okay, very true. But so I think, I don't think it's like, I don't think it's a big ask to ask for the core people in the central government to be aligned on this. But no, I think we need the investment. Like, we haven't had any investment really in infrastructure in the UK in the last 30 years. And so if Rachel Reeves has tried to bounce the cabinet here, which I think she might have tried to done, fair play to her, because she's, at least it's actually forced everyone to make a decision and get on with it.
Someone needs to steer the ship. It's just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic at this point, isn't it?
Matt and I were saying that before you joined the call.
These are all marginal gains. There's no inspirational policy here. There is no drastic urgency. She said these reports are going to come out, in the summer. Like the third runway has been debated probably since before I was born, but certainly from the 80s. And then Gordon Brown greenlit it. And then I think the Lib Dem Conservative Party cancelled it, and it was reinvigorated again. And anyway, it won't be ready till 2040 for a plane to land or take off from that runway.
And it's going to cost 14 to 20 billion pounds. And also the government aren't paying for this.
people are not going to stop flying. People are not going to want to stop coming to Europe from other places. Do you want the gateway to Europe to be Schiphol, or do you want it to be Heathrow? So it's a no-brainer for me that you have to be ahead of capacity, especially when it takes us 20 years to build a runway versus 4 years or 2 years in China or Dubai or somewhere else. So that's a prerequisite. What's missing from this is everything else. What's missing is the inspirational infrastructure projects. What's missing are the big changes that we talked about on the last pod or the pod before last, which are going to incentivize money to stay in the UK, that's going to incentivize investment to go into tech, that's going to mean that someone sitting in Croatia or in Spain or in Germany decides to get off their ass and come to the UK and can actually come to the UK to build their OpenAI competitor. And none of those issues are being addressed. This is all just bullshit rhetoric. Oh, we're the party of growth. Literally 2 months ago, you just did exactly the opposite of growth. I don't know how these people can look themselves in the mirror. It's classic political gaslighting. I feel gaslit by this.
It's a very, very good point, because just on that, Andrew, is like we're talking about an airport that will be live in 2040 or maybe even 2050, in the same year where she's just lumped, she's increased national insurance and actually is increasing the cost for all private, all companies, right? And it's like actually making it harder to do business. It's harder to hire, to hire people, to fire people. I mean, for entrepreneurs and business people, they've got, they feel like we've been slapped in the face. So gaslit is a very good description.
I spoke to an owner, and this isn't just for startups. I spoke to the co-owner of a salon in London, and he was saying that they're about to hire, they've just opened a third salon, and they've been going about 10 years. And they were just about to hire a bunch of people. And because the national insurance changes, the numbers don't add up anymore. Now he's completely having to rethink how they hire people, how many people they hire. They're not going to hire them. They're going to push more people onto contract. Like, none of these people in the government have really been deeply in business. They don't get it. And they're not listening to the people who have. And it's exceptionally frustrating, particularly when continually you look at all the policy in the US, which is decrease taxes and incentivize growth and increase spending, even if it means more debt, and the economy grows. And what do we do in Europe and the UK? We do the opposite. We decrease spending, try and tighten the purse strings, and increase taxes. And we're surprised why we're flatlining. I don't think you need to be an economist. I do not need a PPE degree to understand what's wrong here.
No, I want to see more on the regulation side. I know that the other big story this week was around pension reforms and Reeves seeking to unlock even more money from UK pensions. I couldn't see any connection to the Mansion House Compact. That I couldn't see any dialogue connecting those two schemes together. But what they're looking at is releasing another 100 billion from the surplus. Now, I had to work out what a surplus was with regards to pensions.
Do you want to explain quickly for everybody?
Well, it just feels like a bit of a flimsy request. So when a scheme has more assets than it needs to service its members, it has a surplus. But I was trying to work out the timings. Now, Mads, you might have some more insight to this, but it feels quite you can make a promise, we've got 100 billion in surplus, whatever, and then all of a sudden the next month you don't. So how does it work? Do you know what the mechanics are?
That's precisely right. That's precisely right. I think what has been proposed so far doesn't really work. I mean, let's take a step back. So UK pensions, it's about £3 trillion in total. So actually a little bit bigger than GDP. It's quite a lot of money. About £1.5 billion are in what's called defined benefits. So that's when retirees, they are guaranteed a certain benefit, often their final salary, when they retire. And then £1 billion is in defined contributions, i.e. you pay in a kind of an amount every year, and then that's invested, and then that's converted into a pension once you at the point of retirement. So the two things are very different, right? Because in one, you have a defined benefit that you have to target. So if you're investing money, you're trying to target a certain value of that investment at the point in time the people that are on that plan retire. And to do that, you have trustees overseeing those pension plans. And the challenge is that as a trustee, you're completely responsible for. You have a fiduciary obligation to make sure there is enough money in that pension plan to meet the needs of those pensions when the pensioners retire, when people retire from work. Now, the challenge of saying that it's fine, companies can take some of the money back out of the plans if there's a surplus. The question then becomes, at what point in time is that? And how do you measure it? Because those values can go up, and as we have seen this week, they can go down. And on the current legislation, the trustees would be, if not personally liable, then at least responsible for making sure the money is there. So to fix this, you'd have to create safe harbor provisions for trustees, and you'd have to set specific thresholds for what constitute adequate capital. I mean, let's just take a very simple example. I might calculate that I need 100 million pounds in my plan 20 years from now to have enough money to pay out pensions. And I might have 50 million today. And I'm going to have to make some assumptions around how that money is going to grow over time to be worth enough that it can cover pensions. And so the question is, when is there enough? So it doesn't feel like it's very thought through to me. And this is not kind of, Andrew, to your point from earlier. I think it's very easy to become party political on this. I saw a headline in the Telegraph the other day saying, well, the biggest threat to growth is Rachel Reeves. But it's not exactly as if the other team was doing very well either. If you look at the UK's economic performance over the last 5, even 10 years, it's been pretty abysmal. And we even had a prime minister who I think when asked about what business thought said something like FUCK, business. And so I actually think on both sides of the aisle, it's been pretty abysmal. And I just think we should expect a lot more, starting with a fundamental understanding just of how business works from our politicians, not one party or the other, but frankly, all of them.
Well, none of them worked in business. To your point, Andrew, none of the Labour cabinet have ever worked in business, so it might be a bit of a tough conversation. And the other thing that I kind of was when I was reading through all the reports was Reeves was talking about this pension surplus going into riskier assets, and it made me think what they deem riskier assets. Because I always wonder how they perceive and how they understand how innovation works and where that newness comes from.
Yeah, but a simple way to think about it, Dan, is if you have a company that runs a pension plan, then that company will be funding that plan. And effectively what it's saying is the company can then take some of the capital back. And presumably that is then to invest in the company, right? So I run a manufacturing business. I put 50 million into the pension plan. I can now see there's a surplus. I take 5 million back out that I can reinvest in my business to help make it grow.
Oh, so it's direct.
Yeah. So I mean, so I think that the principle of it makes sense at a very high level. It's just that because of the way we have fiduciary obligations, because of the way trustees operate, the detail is really complicated here.
There's going to be a small trickle through. Like I think, like
small fry. I agree.
Reeves' announcement was aim to like steal or start some momentum with some PR grabbing headlines. Like as Andrew and we point, Heathrow isn't going to be online for another 14, 15, maybe 20 years, right? The pensions high level numbers are massive, as Mads said. It's amazing that defined benefit schemes, as a matter of the defined benefit schemes, which we're getting rid of in this country, right? Because the idea of promising somebody for life a fixed amount of money on their final salary, people realized was an insane concept, right? So,
especially seeing we're now living into our hundreds, it's even more insane.
Exactly. So they're being sunsetted, right? But they exist, and they historically, when I graduated, I remember, working a little bit on this. These things were all in deficit, and it was a major problem. Now we have the benefit after the low interest rate environment that they're in surplus. And, there's quite a big surplus we're talking about in the defined benefit, which is roughly half the industry, at least 100 billion. But no one's going to put more than like 1 or 2% of that into venture. And these people not these people, but these like very smart, potentially smart, but very risk averse and trustees who have all these obligations. We're in the weeds here. Like for most people, like venture is incredibly, they think normal private equity is risky. We're like off the spectrum when it comes to risk. So I think it's great. We're not going to say no to the money. But what will happen, by the way, is that the money will come and it will be in the kind of low single digit billions over a few years. And it will be allocated to, quite frankly, guys, the most boring risk averse like allocators of venture in Europe, right? So it's probably not even going to be that exciting. I'm not going to name any names, but the kind of more risk averse kind of funds that I think exist to gather assets under management rather than performance fee.
Name some names, Lomax. Get it out.
I'm not naming names.
I think your point about where the money goes is really interesting, though. And look, I happen to work like you in the riskiest stuff, in this deep tech, the game-changing technology. But of course, there's a place and a need to fund the more established, predictable markets, like fintech. In Europe and London is a good example. You mentioned Swan earlier. There are probably over 100 banks in Europe with assets under management of over 100 billion. I think the biggest is HSBC with over 2 trillion in assets. So there's a huge amount of opportunity for fintech challenges and platforms and banks, new banks, and a clear path to exit and for M&A within Europe. So that's a good thing. The problem is we've just got to also fund the really risky stuff unless you want to be owned by America with AI and quantum and everything else.
Listen, I want to get onto DeepSeek because that's a very natural segue into what's Europe's position now that DeepSeek has ruffled some feathers.
Yeah, I think there's maybe another point to touch on. We will cover, and we must cover DeepSeek, but just while we're on the UK government, to Andrew's point, there is a surprising lack of creativity in the thinking we're seeing. We have the most powerful technological revolution in our hands right now with AI, and we are looking at kind of these massive areas that absorb funds, right? Like the NHS, this massive black hole we keep putting more and more money into. And then there's this whole notion that we almost can't do any innovation because we can't afford it, when really the thing we should be doing is being extremely aggressive about automating and applying AI.
You can't afford not to.
You can't, but not only you literally can't afford not to, because we cannot even afford to run the NHS to the service levels that people have come to expect and that you've had in the past, because we are going broke. So it seems to me that the thing one should be doing if one is in government right now is to be super aggressive about really pushing the AI agenda to the frontline services in health, in education, in security, and everywhere where you can, to create economic opportunity. And that will then trickle through to innovation everywhere.
They are talking about it. I mean, this is, I think, maybe to Andrew's kind of feeling gaslit point. I've never seen a government release so many PR articles about investment, growth, innovation. But the challenge is being brave enough to actually do it.
Where's the policy? All the departments need to understand that growth is the number one goal, and underneath that, there should be no more than a handful of initiatives which we believe will ensure we achieve growth, which of AI, which should be one, clearly.
Couple of things to end on. Like, don't forget we have a Labour government in the UK. Remember where the Labour government came from. Like, are those the best people to be stewards of growth in the UK? And I'm not going to,
no politician
but we're stuck with them. We're stuck with them. Unless you want to start the revolution, Lomax. I mean,
we'll be behind you in the streets.
And the second thing I want to say, because we sort of touched on in the beginning, in fact, this Silicon Valley thing, right? So talk about this, like recreating Silicon Valley. First of all, have any of you driven from Oxford to Cambridge? You're basically driving across fields. Like it's one of actually the hardest journeys going from east to west in the UK is very virtually impossible. But you do not recreate Silicon Valley with buildings, with roads, with houses. I'm sorry. Like, Silicon Valley is I was thinking about it earlier. It's a certain like savoir-faire. It's an esprit de corps. It's like it's a movement. It's not buildings. It's not infrastructure. And how do you kind of foster that? Forget what Rachel Reeves said. It's not with airports. It's actually with immigration. It's with softer things, to be honest. It's with smart, skills-based immigration. It's with fostering talent. It's deregulation. It's encouraging success stories and actually making sure that the companies that do start to break out have the ability, and maybe it is funding them, or if they're good enough, they should be able to grow themselves. So the notion that Rachel Reeves is going to create a Silicon Valley, that is for the birds. That is really for the birds.
When I did my first company, because I grew up in Cambridge, it was Silicon Fen. They used to go, we're going to build Silicon Fen. And that's still being banded around. But as I said, I've whinged about the train line from Cambridge to London many a time, including on this podcast. And you can't even hold a telephone call. So let's get you need the basics. I'm with you, it's a mindset. But if you don't have the basic infrastructure, you're fucked.
Get the basics in. I want to, this isn't a European story, but it does have deep-reaching European implications. We cannot this week not talk about DeepSeek. So I don't even know where to start. I've been
I'll start.
reading and
I can start.
and Matt. No, Andrew, crack on. Go for it.
I think it's a storm in a teacup because
okay.
claiming IP infringement when your entire company is built on infringing everybody else's IP is classic big tech. So I just view this as healthy competition. I think this is classic capitalism. Why are they complaining? Just get on with building better tech, which works cheaper. They should buy my company there for 10 billion, and then they'll be well ahead for the next 10 years.
It has been a fascinating week. But Mads, I mean, you were talking about this back in December, and we've had conversations all throughout January about these incredible models and what they're doing. And we can get into, did they steal? What is distillation? Some of the mechanics of it. But you were looking at this stuff back in December. Give us a little bit of a run through.
Yeah, so December 26th, when most of us were busy kind of tucking into turkey and other Christmas delicacies, the DeepSeek team released version 3 of their model, which really was the big innovation. I mean, that was sort of the groundbreaking movement. And in the tech community, folks were looking at it and saying, well, this is actually really, really cool. It's really impressive. It's really performant. It was completely open source. The white paper that accompanied the model was very impressively written. And there were a number of innovations that I think genuinely put the Chinese model developers on the map. So for the first time, you had a team that wasn't a US team that had been able to shift the curve of efficiency in developing new models. Many folks will be familiar with the term scaling laws, sort of this notion we have that to make models better, we can make models better if we put more GPUs, more chips, and more data behind them. And the scaling laws would say, well, every time you you put a factor of 10 more of GPUs and data behind a model, you can make the model, let's say, 20 or 30% better. And so they've been pretty immutable over the last couple of years. But what the DeepSeek team managed to do was to create some innovation in the model architecture itself that meant they were able to make the models better without just putting a lot more chips and a lot more data behind them. And that was
Mads,
terrific.
quick question on that. Is this because they were restricted on chips? They were using the H100s and the models before. Was this? Do you think this was a result of the Americans stopping chip sales to China?
Maybe. I think it's possibly a little too early to say that there is a real impact of that yet. It's possible. I mean, we always say necessity is the mother of invention. So whether it was because they just didn't have access to the chips, or possibly more likely, given what we can see, is they have more chips than they've used, but they took the route of trying to be more efficient for other reasons. They were very successful. And that's the first time that's happened. And that has created, a level of maybe frustration or upsetness in the West. It's just that we didn't pay attention at the time. And then they released R1 of the model last week, and people started to pay attention. Interestingly, that V3 probably was the bigger innovation, but it just took us a bit of time. So some sour grapes now. There's been all this, as Andrew said, all this blame. People are saying they cheated. They had more GPUs. They were using many more GPUs than they've been saying. They were stealing IP. Sam Altman has been saying, although, yes, as you say, he's been pretty good at borrowing IP, I think he calls it.
But Mads, they've been training. It's fairly obvious they've been training their model, and it looks like they've been training their model on Sonnet and on O1 from OpenAI. Yes. So, and that's where this whole notion of distillation comes from. And that's not. I mean, that does make you incredibly more efficient. Well, okay. I mean, I carry on now because I also want to get onto maybe the kind of the TikTok implications and the broader European implications. But carry on for now. It's great.
So what's interesting is that there are other really strong models coming out of China. So Alibaba has Gwen, ByteDance, they've got the Duobao, and they're both really, really performant and great models. And it just sort of shows that the whole notion of us trying to keep AI in the West is probably not working. Now that said, Amodei from Anthropic has come out strongly in favor of continuing the export restrictions. He says that we expect that the scaling laws will continue, and although there is innovation at the architectural level, you're still going to benefit from scale. And the chips that the DeepSeek team have been using are chips they could buy, because they bought before these restrictions came into force. But the expectation is that, from Amodei's point, that he is really one of the thought leaders in this space, is that scaling laws will continue to apply. And so he's arguing, look, we should continue to have these export restrictions. Just before we move on, there's one other point, and this may be one for you, Dan, because as many of the NASDAQ, many of the Max 7 stocks were tanking last week, and especially companies like NVIDIA and Broadcom were feeling the heat. One company went up, and that was Apple. And at first, people were speculating that it's because Apple is so irrelevant to AI that anybody who is a serious AI investor just didn't care about them and didn't care to short the stock. But there is another notion, which is that the commoditization of the models should, all else equal, move power to people that have, may not have model knowledge, but have hardware and data. And of course, that massively favors Apple. So I know you've been sort of iterating a couple of times.
What should we do? Is it round of applause for Dan, is it?
2025 is the year of Apple and AI. But there's actually some sense that it may come good.
Yeah, so for those that haven't heard me rattle on about this incessantly, I do believe that regardless of the reality and whether they faked it or stole this or did that, it does lean into this. If you have that network and access, that the leverage that you can create from these lower cost models, and you can once you have that, once you own your own network, like Apple has this massive network of users and reach, that you can really lever it. So I think yeah, on the consumer side, I think that's going to be a massive play for them. Now, Lomax, you've got some notes on what's been happening with DeepSeek. What have we missed? Where are the gaps?
No. I think not. Well, I mean, everyone's a DeepSeek expert these days if you open LinkedIn. So I'll be careful about what I say, rather than not wishing to contribute too much to the noise. But there's maybe three observations I would say. Maj referred to Dario Amodei and his opinions on the enhanced export controls. That's the CEO of Anthropic. He put out a really good piece, I think today or yesterday, also explaining how when you actually break it down, the costs order of magnitude is actually not way off what one might expect. So it's a really interesting piece that I would recommend people to dig out and have a look at. I think three observations. One is, I think doing the trawl of social media to get a sentiment here. Our friend Nathan at Air Street put out an interesting comment, saying, we have a nation tight with great talent and with limited resources and budget or limited access. China have developed this. Why have Europe not done the same thing? Obviously we have Mistral, but you know what I mean? It's like everyone's complaining about us not having the tens of billions going into AI. But where's Europe's defense on this? I mean, clearly we have an amazing.
The fact that it was a Chinese outfit and not Mistral that did this,
it's a bit depressing, is it? I know.
Face. Yeah.
And the founder, he used the same methodology to build his hedge fund, and they've only been going just over a year. So it's quite a crazy story if you dig behind it. Andrew, have you got any thoughts on this? Did you want to dig into anything?
Oh, can I finish my point? Sorry, is that all right?
Oh yeah, go.
Right,
sorry, yeah.
No, I think
do it.
I mean, there've been a lot of people who are not only experts on DeepSeek, but they're also experts on this concept of Jevons paradox these days, right? So yes. I think we've talked about NVIDIA being a big sufferer here in terms of the dent in its market cap being the being the maker.
A measly
of these
600
picks.
billion, I think, was
but ultimately, I think if you step back from this, I think it's ultimately a good thing in terms of AI. Like more and more smart people working on it. The US have now just had a firecracker put up their backsides, Trump will probably be picking up the phone to these guys. Well, I thought you promised me dominance. Now, make sure you frigging deliver.
Yeah, Tariff City, I imagine. Some kind of
Yeah,
Tariff City.
no,
for the
I just think
Chinese.
that, in terms of it depends what you think about the AI race, by the way. Like you may not think it's a good thing, but if you think it's a good thing in that, tech can change the world, et cetera, then, things have just got even more supercharged. Ultimately, and to go back to Jevons paradox, the point is the NVIDIA stock has taken a pummeling because people think that this will massively reduce their ability to ship products in the future, and
You
lose
have to
pricing
explain
power.
what Jevons paradox is now. You have to.
No,
have to
I
share
will
Jevons
now.
paradox.
Effectively now saying that actually, if you believe the efficiencies of the Chinese model, this will actually enhance the proliferation of AI, like the proliferance. Like we will have more and more use of AI, which actually will in turn be good for NVIDIA rather than bad for NVIDIA, right?
Because it came from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, if I remember correctly. It's about coal, wasn't it? It was the fact that as machines became more efficient and they needed less coal, they sold more coal. That was the paradox, I think, originally.
So yeah, exactly. So then you can apply that to AI. I mean, you believe in it or you don't, but I think it's certainly a strong argument.
Well, the efficiencies are massive. I was looking at some of the costs. I mean, I think it was $4.40 for 1 million tokens on ChatGPT, and it was like 10 cents on DeepSeek R1. So and they were saying that what cost 5 billion cost them $5 million. I mean, the numbers weren't even like a 10-20% saving. They were.
Yeah, but I wouldn't. I said read Dario Amadei's piece on that. I mean, he's got some bias, but I would read it. It's very interesting.
Yeah, listen, it's a nice poke in the eye to Trump, isn't it? So it's a lovely, after all the TikTok debacle. And this is one other thing I want to just quickly frame. I mean, we are effectively giving data to the Chinese government. I don't know what the reality is of that, but if there was a TikTok challenge, there is definitely a DeepSeek challenge. Sure.
We'll just run it locally if you want to get geeky, and then you don't.
Yeah, and it's open source, and that's all wonderful stuff. But it just feels like you don't really know how these things work. I'm not even sure the developers know how it works. But Andrew, I've monopolized too much. What? Any closing thoughts on DeepSeek?
I just think we're so early in this journey with AI, and we forget that sometimes. So there are going to be lots of plot twists and turns, and there are going to be some impressive technical step changes that seemingly come out of nowhere, pretty much like OpenAI came out of nowhere, but actually, started in 2015, was it?
The overnight success that took 10 years to get there, that one.
Yeah. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So it's going to be an exciting few years.
That is a very good point. And actually, again, reflecting on my social media meanderings this week, Saranga, the partner at Balderton, put out a post about this, basically saying, just let's not forget here, guys, we're still very, 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 very early on the frontier here. Like no one really knows anything. We're all still learning. Let's be careful, but let's learn and explore. Let's also acknowledge that tons of money is going to get lost in a lot of these projects, right? But that's fine. That's part of the model in the industry. And I think that's something we sometimes forget. When my dad is, WhatsApping me about DeepSeek, which is quite frankly astonishing. It reminds me of when my mother-in-law was asking me about Bitcoin a few years ago.
Yes.
In the last run, it's like always the time to
my mum in her 80s told me to invest. I'll put about this thing called Bitcoin.
Always a time to head in the other direction. But it's like, let's not, we're playing around at the absolute frontier here. So yeah, as Andrew says, we just don't know a lot.
It's funny to think that we haven't really hit the application layers yet. I mean, we're talking about the foundational models. We haven't really seen, 25 was supposed to be the year of agentic workflow, which I still passionately believe it will be, but we haven't even really applied a lot of these incredible technologies. And very, very quickly, I want to take one step back because, Mads, we were talking about, was it ChatGPT Gov? There's a government edition of ChatGPT, which I was always wondering. It doesn't seem like it's doing anything out of the ordinary that you wouldn't see in the enterprise or in standard businesses. It's being used at the Air Force Research Lab, Los Alamos Lab, Minnesota and Pennsylvania state agencies, and OpenAI launched this ChatGPT Gov. And I'm wondering, will there be a UK version? Can you imagine the civil service using it?
Where we're going with this? Is this Skynet version 0.1?
Yeah, Miles Dyson's got his finger on the trigger. So I love that. I mean, there's obviously so much more to dig into with DeepSeek, but very, very quickly to round off, round of the week, we've got 11 labs. Now they've done 11 labs are raising 250 million at 3 billion, and they're not even three years old. A lovely European AI voice generator. Now, Lomax, I think you threw this in the docket. Anything that you wanted to add to a nice big juicy round for them?
No, like actually, we've had now 3 big mega rounds, right, this year already. Like it's great to see these mega rounds happening in Europe. It's great to see them happening in very short timelines. So as you said, this company is 3 years old.
Yeah.
It's great to see employees or former employees of big tech companies in Europe, like Palantir and Google, in setting up and founding these companies in Europe. It's amazing to see, the momentum that they've got. And I think it's just great to have it. And, actually a couple of the seed funds that got in right at the beginning, we know really, really well. And, the returns for them are going to be absolutely like career making. So I think, we talk about, new managers coming through, backing entrepreneurs. And, with deals like this, they're probably returning many, and just to step back here, right? If you're running a 50 mil seed fund and you got in early, if you're holding, 10% of this company or 5% of this company, I mean, you're already looking at a kind of 3, 4, 5x fund, right? So that's very,
Loving
very
your work.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, hats off to the founders, but hats off to, the guys who backed them early. And that's what this industry needs. It reminds me that, the US venture capital industry has got, 50, 60, 70 years of like cycles and returns. And we are still very early in Europe. And, this stuff just does take time. But, we've seen Neko 250 last week. These are big rounds now. And I'm actually I've been telling you guys that I'm a bit like, I'm very down on European risk capital, but you know what? I mean, actually, maybe I'm wrong.
Good for them. And it comes back to the original ARM story, those 18 entrepreneurs. I mean, ARM was set up in the 90s. I think it might even been 1990 when ARM started. So it takes time for this recycling and this connection, not hopefully that long, but it's great that we're starting to get this full stack happening in Europe. Right, lovely, Pete. Oh, Andrew, Alice and Bob, what's happening there?
So European quantum computing startup, they have a type of allegedly a superconducting circuit that by design is like more resilient to noise. Not many people are focused on this particular type of quantum computing technology. I think AWS are interested in it as well. Series B round led by AXA Venture Partners. Great to see them doing this sort of high risk stuff. And then Future French Champions, which I think is an amalgamation of like the Qatar and BPI France, both sovereign wealth funds. So, classic again, where's the money coming from? Oh, look, it's the government. But just great that the round happened. We've got a competing company in our portfolio, Universal Quantum, building quantum computers, but I just think that it's fantastic to see quantum getting funded, actually in a way that perhaps AI hasn't been historically in Europe.
I've seen a lot of quantum news this week. There's been a lot of quantum noise and a few headlines. So I think maybe AI is taking all the heat.
Well,
so it
guys,
should,
quantum stocks are up. Literally, and actually, Quantinium, which is actually former UK company called Cambridge Quantum Computing, which merged with Honeywell. So it's half UK, I would say, half European. It's slated for an IPO this year, and people have been talking about. Yeah, their last private market valuation was 5 billion, and people have been talking about 10, 15, 20 billion at IPO. So that's a pretty big outcome. And the actual listed quantum tech stocks, you've got Rigetti at 3 billion, you've got IonQ, I think now at 5, 6 billion. I mean, you've got D-Wave at 2, 3 billion. By the way, D-Wave and Rigetti were both like bankrupt at some point. So quantum's going through a bit of it's got a bit of a shot in the arm at the moment. So long may that continue.
A bit like Tesla's self-driving is in 5 years, and there's that kind of, at some point, quantum, when we say, oh, we're about 5 years out, somebody will be true, saying the truth. So I look forward to that day.
You've got, UK and Europe have got some great stories in quantum, and actually PsiQuantum, which is probably one of the most well-funded quantum companies in the world, came out of the University of Bristol. I mean, it's basically become a US company now, sadly. And it probably is an example of where actually they had to move to the US to raise the money. But, the IP and the tech and the talent came out of both Australia and University of Bristol. So I think, and there's some great, quantum startups in the UK that are really showing some really, really compelling data. So I think that we can do a session on quantum, I think, in the future.
I think we should.
It's very exciting.
Before we sign off, I wanted to throw something out there, actually.
Do it. Chuck it in.
Did anyone
Throw
see
the
this,
brick.
this Gen Z survey come out of 3,000 Gen Zs? And that's at age up to 27 years old, right? So they're not all kids. Said that 47% of them want Britain to be a dictatorship because politics doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
I thought it was fascinating.
This is a very good point. And by the way, wasn't that men? Or was that
fascinating?
Was that men or was that Gen Z? Was it just men?
That's Gen Z. That's Gen Z.
The whole
Because there's this if you look at the data for young men in particular, who's felt like very pushed out by the kind of, the woke left, they are big backers of Trump, big backers of the strongmen. And guys, one thing we didn't talk about was Elon Musk on stage at the AFD rally this week. I mean, I think that is mental.
I don't want to give that guy in the air.
AFD are now polling at 20%. So they're second. And by the way, it's the German elections at the end of February. So it's round the corner. AFD, as a reminder, the Alternative for Deutschland, the sort of far right, anti-immigrant German party is now second in the polls. But you had Elon addressing their rally, absolutely pumping it. I'm very worried.
Actually, I got this wrong. It's worse. It's 52% think that the UK should be a dictatorship. 47% agree with the statement that the entire way of our society is organised must be radically changed through revolution.
Yeah, they've been listening to too much Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, and these people are, I'm afraid, it's very scary. And it's very relevant to us because this is the future.
In defense of Kermit the Frog, I'm not sure it's fair to put Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate in the same bracket, actually, at all.
I don't know, man. I don't know. Okay.
But Peterson is off the ranch. He has definitely left the ranch. He left the ranch
100%. I'd say new wave Peterson is off the reservation. Yeah.
I was a massive fan. I was a massive fan. But this does remind me. I'm a big fan of Scott Galloway, and it does remind me of he a number of years ago was extremely anxious around the number of lonely young men there were in society who are obviously being drawn and dragged into Trump spheres and Andrew Tate spheres because there has been almost a disenfranchisement of young men. And this is possibly not a topic we should ever dig into, but I think there's so many conflating challenges here. Anywho,
talk about Peterson going off reservation. I would end on this, and actually, I think this is something I've been thinking about Elon recently, which is like Elon is a phenomenal entrepreneur, and I take my hat off to the guy. So many things, but watching him of late with his dabblings in politics, I start to worry about Elon, to be honest. And like watching him on stage in Germany, I got very scared. I'm very scared about it, and there's sort of like lack of detail and it's very, I find it very discomforting.
Well, as Eddie Izzard once said, mass murderers come from the places you least expect them. So let's hope he never turns the corner.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus. We were doing so well at being optimistic. We were doing so well at being positive, and we've fallen into that.
Your fault. You invited me on the show.
I did. That was.
What do you expect?
Listen, let's end on a positive note. Andrew, what are you looking forward to this week? What's happening for you?
I have, for the rest of the week, very few meetings. I potentially head down some deep work. Very excited by that.
Any themes or topics you want to share?
Just changing the world. Is that
okay? Just a small little notion. Lomax, what's on your agenda this week?
The thing I'm most excited about, just closed a investment in a UK defense company. So I'm starting to roll our sleeves up with the founder now and make plans and help where we can. Nice. So that's the most exciting thing, I'd say.
Nice. Mads, what's cooking for you?
Oh, there's so much. We've got two amazing founders that have just closed great rounds. Or kind of one's just closed and the other one has just signed term sheet, but has worked towards a closing. We've got another one we're working on, a new investment we're making, a fascinating AI company that we hopefully can talk about in a few weeks. So yeah, so much good stuff happening. Just loving the founders we work with. Easy to criticize and be down on stuff, but there's also so much optimism and so much excitement around, and I think that's it's a great thing to work with every day.
Yeah, no, I think that's the joy of what we do, is that we get to see the innovation at the coalface. All the
Don't
successes
forget,
and
Dan, we've got to be a bit on brand as Europeans. We can't be all, euphoric and enthusiasm. We've got to be
just
a little
be
bit
miseries.
We've got to be a little bit, but otherwise people will be like, what are these people even in Europe,
Yeah, these Americans talking funny. We've got an investor day this week, so we're showcasing 6 of our teams to some of the investors in our last fund, which I think is going to be a lovely afternoon. Looking forward to that. And I'm also doing a talk at London Stock Exchange about investing in AI and the future of AI. So I'm very much looking forward to that on Thursday. But gentlemen, it is always a gift and a pleasure. I will catch up with you next week. Have bloody good ones.
Thank you
Love
very much.
You all. Have a good one.
Catch you, Dan.
Bye
Ciao,
bye.
ciao.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.